Step out of the real world for a moment and welcome to the grand lobby of our classic movie palace. I'm your host and usher for today's Cinematic Explainer, and we are about to dive into an incredible 6-week journey through the evolution of 80s and 90s film. You know, for decades, the absolute most important conversation about movies in America didn't happen in some fancy Hollywood boardroom. Nope, it happened in a darkened theater balcony in Chicago, where Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert held court. Their simple verdict, a thumbs up or a thumbs down, could literally shape a film's destiny.
So, before the velvet curtains pull back, let's take a quick peek at our vintage playbill for today's syllabus. We'll be moving through 6 sessions: Hollywood at the Crossroads, The Great Divide, Men Grow Up, Breaking Genres, The Power of Place, and finally, The Blockbuster Matures.
All right, taking our seats in the balcony for Session 1, Hollywood at the Crossroads, the tale of two silences.
So, picture it. It's 1980. American cinema is recovering from the total collapse of the 70s auteur era. And what's absolutely fascinating is how both the roaring action films and the quiet, intimate dramas of this new era relied on the exact same tool. It's called nonverbal acting. Basically, this means driving character development and narrative tension entirely through physical gesture, posture, and micro-expressions, completely bypassing explicit dialogue. Before the 80s, we had seen decades of bouncing back and forth between grand theatricality and gritty naturalism. But at this crossroads, the actor's physical body, acting as a narrative engine, became the primary vehicle for storytelling, whether you were watching a prestige drama or a massive popcorn hit.
Now, this technique really paved two distinct paths forward for Hollywood. Internal realism on one side and external spectacle on the other. Take a film like Ordinary People. Mary Tyler Moore uses this repressive silence and incredibly tense defensive posture, even forcing a fake smile that never quite reaches her eyes, to show a family that is just collapsing inward. But then, look at Raiders of the Lost Ark. Harrison Ford gives us this anticipatory silence completely full of outward centrifugal energy. His weary reactions, like that famous exhausted sigh and single pistol shot against the swordsman, communicate profound character competence without a single word of exposition. It's brilliant.
Moving right along, as the projector flickers, we hit Session 2, The Great Divide, aesthetic vision versus moral compass. The 1980s brought us these wonderfully dark, fractured narratives, and they ignited some of the most passionate disagreements between our two critics. It really came down to a philosophical clash. Do you evaluate a film by the brilliance of its shape or by the sincerity of its soul? Siskel approached films as an aesthetic formalist. If a director had a singular vision and executed it with masterful technical skill, Siskel would champion it, regardless of the moral ambiguity. Ebert, on the other hand, was a true moral humanist. He fundamentally believed that if a filmmaker was going to tackle difficult, painful subjects, they entered into an ethical contract with the audience. The film had to justify its cruelty and maintain a moral compass. Honestly, nothing highlighted this divide better than David Lynch's 1986 surreal neo-noir Blue Velvet. Siskel enthusiastically defended the film. He argued that its jarring shift from sunny, picture-perfect suburbia straight into an absolute nightmare was a total masterpiece of audience manipulation. To Siskel, that dissonance wasn't a flaw, it was the whole point. The director wanted to play you like a piano, and Siskel felt he pulled it off perfectly.
Ebert, though, he gave it a resounding thumbs down. He strongly felt that the campy, sitcom-level satire of the town mocked the very real, harrowing trauma being experienced by the characters. For Ebert, an audience's emotional response shouldn't just be exploited for a cheap tonal trick. If you're going to depict brutal degradation on screen, he demanded that it be placed within a morally important framework, not just treated as a cynical inside joke.
And this deep philosophical divide naturally spilled over into how they judged a film's actual structure. We call this contextual criticism, judging a film against its own specific ambitions. For instance, Ebert held directors strictly to their own promises. He actually rejected Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, arguing it felt like a disjointed book of short stories rather than a cohesive novel. Because Kubrick was an undisputed master, Ebert held him to the absolute highest standard of narrative integrity. But get this, astonishingly, on that very same show, Ebert gave a thumbs up to Benji the Hunted. Why? Because while Full Metal Jacket failed its grand, complex ambitions, Benji perfectly achieved its much more modest goal of simply being a charming movie about a dog surviving in the wilderness.
Okay, on to Session 3, Men Grow Up, the Shift in Masculinity.
After a whole decade of explosive, stoic action heroes, the culture was ready to look inward again. This brought about the rise of what became affectionately known as the male weepy. Think about films like The Shawshank Redemption. It wasn't just a horror story about physical imprisonment. Siskel and Ebert championed it as a massive emotional triumph. These were 90s dramas about men healing and the slow, decades-long development of hope behind bars. It signaled a huge cultural shift in how masculinity was portrayed on screen, favoring deep psychological prisons and profound mentorship over just, stoic violence.
Next up, Session 4, Breaking Genres, Postmodern 90s Cinema. The 90s was the era where filmmakers playfully and sometimes violently dismantled classic genre rules, really mirroring the anxieties of the time. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction completely shattered linear storytelling, forcing the audience to piece the timeline together themselves and elevating so-called low culture into high art. Meanwhile, The Silence of the Lambs elevated a pretty standard serial killer pulp concept into an incredibly intense, intelligent psychological duel. It swept the Academy Awards. Though true to form, Siskel and Ebert still debated its merits, with Ebert criticizing the film for eventually devolving into a standard monster in the house trope right at the end.
As the massive studio system chased guaranteed hits, we arrive at Session 5, The Power of Place, championing indie film.
Here's where we really see the true power of the critic, using a national platform to rescue brilliant, overlooked stories. When the Academy shockingly snubbed Hoop Dreams, this epic, multi-year, intimate portrait of two inner-city Chicago families chasing basketball stardom, Siskel and Ebert waged a national campaign to defend it. They literally called it one of the greatest American films ever made. Similarly, they championed the Coen brothers' Fargo as a quirky, infectious masterpiece. They praised its absolute precision with regional Minnesota dialogue and the total freedom of its storytelling. They turned the spotlight away from the coasts to illuminate these deeply human realities.
Finally, the lights dim for our last class. Session 6, The Blockbuster Matures, High Concept with the Soul.
So by the 1990s, the major studios realized that groundbreaking visual effects simply weren't enough anymore. Audiences wanted philosophical depth. The 1980s had cemented the high-concept film, a movie you could pitch in a single sentence, designed for massive marketing campaigns. But as we entered the 90s, filmmakers started taking these massive, glossy premises and injecting them with genuine internal stakes. Just think about the incredible structural connection between Terminator 2 and Groundhog Day. I mean, on the surface, they couldn't be more different, right? But look at the structural kinship here. Both films take entirely impossible, high-concept sci-fi premises, a shape-shifting cyborg from the future, and a guy doomed to repeat the exact same day for eternity. But they use these fantastical hooks strictly as pressure cookers to force a character's internal evolution. A literal machine learns the moral value of human life, and a deeply cynical weatherman moves from pure selfishness to profound empathy. This proves that by the 1990s, internal character growth had become the ultimate cinematic spectacle, seamlessly blending the aesthetic spectacle of a blockbuster with the moral humanism of an indie drama. By studying this incredible era of film, we learn that critical thinking isn't just for quiet art films. Rigor applies absolutely everywhere, whether you're watching a liquid metal cyborg explode or a quiet Midwestern police chief solving a crime. As the lights come back up in our grand movie palace, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder the next time you give a film your own thumbs up or thumbs down. When you take your seat in the theater, do you judge a film by the perfection of its external spectacle or the sincerity of its internal emotional truth? Or, like the very best of cinema, does it manage to somehow achieve both? Thanks so much for joining me in the balcony for this explainer. Keep looking critically and keep enjoying the show.